happened again last Thursday evening on the SBS news service. Photographs of some 12 young men, soldiers, some of them not yet 20 years of age, some 24, some 31, 12 of them, shot dead in Afghanistan or Iraq. Fine-looking fellows. And now their families scattered across the states of America, from Texas to Iowa, from California to New England states, from New Mexico to Indiana. Families distressed forever by their imagination and their memories, reconstructing the possible ways whereby those young fellows may have died. And then there's the dreadful reality afterwards. And I turned the pages again of Rajana Srivastava's book. I've spoken about her before. She's the oncologist in this city. And her job, sadly, again and again, is to bring bad news to people. People facing their bad news. But then she found herself facing her own bad news as she was told that her twins would not live. And she wrote, "I can't help but note the veneer of politeness we doctors maintain in the face of immense loss. It leaves me wondering how and when we develop a different approach to such tragedy." You see, when you've been through the worst, seen the worst, heard the worst, or when you can imagine the worst, you're faced with afterwards. In a recent journal of the Company Directors Institute, John Colvin, the managing director of the Institute, wrote, "There's always room to grow. But there is this but. Something can block that growth. Growth is no longer desired, no longer relevant. We're dominated by the worst that has happened. And even though we may be far into the long and painful time of afterwards, is it meaningful to talk of growth? It's as if a huge stone has been rolled in the way. No growth, no go." Of course, we apply the word growth to the growth of plants in the garden, to the neighbour's dog, to the size of our appetite, but rarely to the resilience and the recovery of the human spirit. Growth. You may look at yourself as you step out of your bedroom each morning. Yes, your mind is functioning. Yes, your physical body is ready to go, but somewhere in the deepest part of the self, that part that some hesitatingly call the human spirit, there's a very troubled patch. There is, no, it's not heart failure, it's not kidney failure, it's spirit failure. The spirit has lost its life, lost its vitality, lost its strength, its resilience, its potential, its joy. Instead, it's there, static, blocked, disinterested. It's like someone sitting there staring out to sea. And this figure of Jesus walked up to Simon Peter and he said, "Simon, dear friend, do you love me?" Suddenly we stop. Men get awfully awkward about talking of love. So he wanted to get off it. Of course you know I love you. Then said Jesus, show your love by putting it into practice. Well, not only men, but the women too are so often tangled up when they're told to show some love. So Jesus said, Simon, good son of your father, oh yes, also your mother, how much do you love me? And so the story said Simon was irritated, maybe even embarrassed, but Jesus persisted. You see, this story, in traditional religious speak, is called a post-resurrection story. Put the idea and the literal story of the resurrection all to one side today. Many of you have heard my views for a long time when I state that the resurrection story, as a literal story, like the crucifixion story, is bathed in fiction. They are the stories of very creative writers, and they are writing long afterwards, for our afterwards. Yes, they're written for us and our afterwards. And if you followed my translation, you can hear the 4 clear steps that Jesus was taking. Own the feelings. Show the feelings. Practice the feelings. Teach the feelings. And notice that each step, he was provoking a movement out of the enclosed and troubled self, out of the grieving, anxious self, and was positively inviting the self into the world of others, into the intersubjective, into the recovery of I and thou. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, I quote him many times. Years ago he wrote, the basic movement of the life of dialogue is the turning towards the other and saying thou. You see, we might have read all the best textbooks. We might be able to recite the 6 core ways to resilience, but the weight of afterwards hangs over us. More than that, there may be any number of well-meaning people telling us where we ought to be, what we ought to do, how we ought to enjoy life and thrive, but something blocks the way. With my other hat, I frequently remind people of that marvelous children's story of 3 billy goats gruff. Most of you, particularly of my era, my age group, will remember it from primary school. It is full of excellent imagery, theological imagery, existential imagery, psychological imagery. The 3 billy goats gruff. They could see the grass over the bridge, and they really did want to get there. But there was this frightening troll under the bridge. And as soon as they began to hesitatingly cross the bridge, the troll exploded in fury. Who is that trying to cross my bridge? And it was only as the big billy goat faced the troll head on that it was able to reduce the troll's power and thus allow them all to go trip-trap over the bridge to the green pastures beyond. And that's the first thing about the resurrection story today. It was a lesson in transcendence. It was a lesson in looking beyond the bridge afterwards. It was to see beyond the power of the troll. It was to overrule the power of their inner anxiety and fear by cultivating a stronger, positive emotion and energy to take them forward. So you see, Jesus was lifting Simon out of himself, pointing to the life he now could lead afterwards. after the trauma, after the humiliation, after all the negatives. He was confronted not with his failure or of his inadequacy or indeed of his sinfulness, not with all the rigmarole and ritual of religion, nor a demand that he should believe this, and that. He was confronted with the possibility of a new faith in himself, a new faith in better emotions, a new faith in life with others, a new faith in what life was ultimately about, caring for others afterwards. So I go to the second aspect of this story, this resurrection day. If you look at the Simon story as a story after the crucifixion, after the death, then we catch Simon in a flat state, spirit low, mind entangled. I picked up this old book of Christopher Fry's, The Sleep of Prisoners, and at one stage he says, "Strange how we trust the powers that ruin and not the powers that bless." So Simon was into this wrongly directed trusting the powers of the past. But in the words of Jesus, afterwards, he was being invited back to life. Invited back to life. And that's the second issue of this story. We're all invited to get back into life. I turn to the very last pages of Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov was in prison, as was his friend Sonia. It had been a long and terrible punishment. But suddenly Sonia was beside him. She had come up noiselessly and sat down close to him. She wore her old, shabby coat and the green shawl, and her face still showed traces of illness. But she smiled at him joyfully and tenderly, and as usual, held out her hand to him timidly. They were alone for a moment. The guard had turned away. Suddenly, in those sick and pale faces, the dawn of a new future, of a full resurrection to a new life, was already shining. These are Dostoevsky's words. It was love that brought them back to life. I go on. They still had to wait another 7 years. And what great suffering and infinite joy till then. He had come back to life, and he knew it and felt it with every fiber of his renewed being. And she, why, she lived only for him. Yes, one man from Gaza in the current era said, "In our scriptures it is written that when you do not have hope, you look for it in the face of your friend." Bringing you back to life, the second issue. The third, Simon was faced with that common human experience. We call it a fork in the road. He could take one part and land up somewhere in what T.S. Eliot called the yellow fog. Or he could take the other path to a reinvestment of the energy of healing and hope in people, in causes, in passions, in possibilities. It would take on the energy and the buzz of bees refurbishing the emotional honeycomb. It is one of the most desirable and enlarging experiences of the afterwards, of searching for that inner refurbishment. refurbishment of the honeycomb, knowing that the refurbishment is there, is possible, and allowing it to happen. Speaking it, showing it, celebrating it, teaching it as a vital part. As vital as the honeycomb is to new life for the bees in the hive, so we need that refurbishment of our inner emotional life afterwards, after the worst has happened. A way to live forwards, outwards, hopefully, creatively, strongly, even tenderly. And so I come to the fourth part of the story. I've been rather fascinated by Colm Toiboinen's latest book, The Empty Family. He tells a story there of a woman who had been through an experience, several distressing experiences. And she was in the afterwards zone of her life. And a neighbor invited her to come in upstairs to the balcony and look through his new telescope out to the waters of the ocean. So she went, and hesitatingly, somewhat cautiously, stood behind the telescope. And then she put her eye up to it and was astonished, really astonished by the sight of the waves miles out. And she said, "It came to me that the sea is not a pattern, it is a struggle. The waves were like people battling out there, full of consciousness and will and destiny, and an abiding sense of their own beauty. As the waves came and withdrew, the ocean seemed to say, this is what the world is, and our time in it. All lifted possibility, all complexity and rushing further, and then to return, to rejoin the empty family from whom we'd set out alone with such a burst of brave, unknowing energy." Oh yes, Dostoevsky, in another one of his stories, reminds us, paradise blooms around us every day. Don't miss it. I see you in the imagery, this plaintive and exhilarating image, a vital part of our afterward experience, experiencing in the depths something of great beauty, the consciousness of the emotional environment out there, the colours that are given in the emotional environment out there, the cantata of sound that comes to us from the emotional environment, and the conversation that we can bring and give to the emotional environment. All of that, the consciousness, the colour, the cantata, the conversation of that environment out there. Of course we know that we can be laid flat and drained empty by the worst experiences in life. But the energy of the resurrection myth brings us alive to the need to take fresh cognizance of our emotional environment, and then to redefine the life we will positively construct. And so in the afterwards event, the Jesus imagery says this: ultimately, whatever has happened, now that it has happened, live in the world in a way that you show what real friendship is. It was the French philosopher Jacques Ellul who wrote, "The important question is not whether I have faith or not, but whether I have received a word, and whether this has created something new in my life." All too often, our friendship becomes so polluted, we cannot hear that vital word, and nor do we speak it. But when we penetrate the pollution, friendship has the possibility of bringing out the freshness, the freedom, the enhancing faith that has been buried for so long. Where are your friends? Do they bring out the best? Do they show what humanity can really become? Jesus was saying, in every afterwards, show the world what friendship really is. He could have been saying, that's what the resurrection is. He could have been saying, that's what I've been pointing to all my life, all the time. The word of friendship, of people being for each other, not against each other, of people being for the fullness of life, in their humanness at its very best. Oh yes, and there's one thing more. On this Easter day, remember, there it is, crossing the bridge, being invited back to life, refurbishing the inner life, enriching, being part of the enriching emotional environment. Easter. Have a good Easter. Please stand.